Right now, somewhere in your body, something is going wrong. A cell is mutating. A virus is testing your defenses. You don't feel it. You won't for days. But when you finally do, you'll reach for a small plastic bottle in your bathroom cabinet without a second thought. You'll swallow a pill shaped by a machine, tested in a lab, approved by a government agency you've never met. This feels normal. It feels like it's always been this way. It hasn't. For most of human history, getting sick meant something completely different. It meant looking around you, at the plants, the animals, the people you trusted, and trying to figure out an answer with nothing but your senses and your memory. So what did ancient humans actually do when they got sick? The first thing to understand is that sickness is not a modern problem. It is one of the oldest problems your species has ever faced. Every human who ever lived, going back hundreds of thousands of years, has had to deal with fever, infection, pain, and injury. Your ancestors didn't have hospitals. They didn't have antibiotics. But they weren't helpless either. They were paying attention. Closely. Consider Shanidar Cave in what is now northern Iraq. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of Neanderthals buried tens of thousands of years ago, surrounded by pollen from yarrow, cornflower, and other flowering plants. For decades, researchers debated what this meant. Were these flowers placed deliberately, as medicine or ritual? Or did bees simply drop pollen into the soil by accident? The debate isn't fully settled. But what is settled is something stranger and more direct. In 2012, researcher Karen Hardy examined the dental plaque of Neanderthals from El Cedron Cave in Spain. Trapped in the hardened calculus on their teeth, she found chemical traces of chamomile and yarrow. Both plants are bitter. Neither is nutritious. Neither would have been eaten for pleasure. And yet the Neanderthals kept eating them anyway. Why would you eat something bitter over and over if it gave you nothing back? The answer researchers arrived at is unsettling in its simplicity. These plants weren't food. They were medicine. Chamomile has anti-inflammatory properties. Yarrow has been used for centuries to treat wounds and settle the stomach. A species we once imagined as brutish and instinct-driven was, in fact, running something closer to a pharmacy, built entirely from observation and trial. This wasn't limited to Neanderthals. Consider Otzi, the man whose frozen body was discovered in the Alps in 1991, preserved by ice for over 5,000 years. When researchers led by Albert Zink examined what Otzi was carrying, they found 2 pieces of birch fungus threaded onto a leather cord. This fungus, Piptoporus betulinus, has natural antibacterial and antiparasitic properties. Otzi's intestines, it turned out, contained whipworm eggs. He was sick, and he was carrying quite literally a piece of medicine with him into the mountains. Here's what should stop you for a second. Otzi didn't have a microscope. He couldn't see a parasite. He had no concept of bacteria. And yet he was carrying the correct treatment anyway. How does a person figure that out with nothing but trial, memory, and time? The answer is generations. Not one clever person figuring it out alone, but thousands of people, over thousands of years, quietly running the longest experiment in human history. Someone eats a plant and feels worse. They remember. They tell someone. Someone else eats a different plant and the fever breaks. They remember that too. Multiply this by 10,000 years across every continent your species ever walked into, and you get something remarkable. An enormous, unwritten, deeply tested body of medical knowledge, carried entirely in memory and passed mouth to mouth, parent to child, healer to apprentice. This knowledge didn't stay primitive for long. By the time you reach ancient Egypt, it had become organized. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dated to around 1600 BCE, but likely copied from a much older source, describes 48 medical cases with a level of clinical precision that still surprises historians today. It documents how to examine a wound, how to assess whether an injury is treatable, and, notably, how to recognize when it is not. This wasn't guesswork. This was a system. Egyptian physicians stitched wounds, set fractures with splints, and used honey as a dressing on open injuries. Modern microbiology later confirmed what they seemed to already know. Honey is naturally antibacterial, low in moisture, and hostile to the bacteria that cause infection. They didn't know the word bacteria. They just knew what worked. But not every ancient response to illness looked like medicine. Some of it looked like fear. And this is where the story gets more complicated and more human. When ancient humans faced diseases they truly could not explain, plagues that swept through a village with no visible cause, they often reached for a different kind of answer, spiritual ones. Illness was blamed on angry spirits, broken taboos, or the will of the gods. This wasn't stupidity, it was pattern recognition doing its best with incomplete data. If your entire framework for the world involves ancestors, spirits, and unseen forces, then illness fits neatly into that framework too. A shaman or healer would treat the physical symptoms and the presumed spiritual cause at the same time, because in their understanding, the two were never separate to begin with. Anthropologist and physician Melvin Connor, who has spent decades studying hunter-gatherer societies like the Kalahari Sun, has documented healing rituals where trance, chanting, and touch play a central role in treatment. To modern eyes, this can look purely symbolic. But Connor's work points to something researchers now take seriously. The placebo effect is not nothing. Belief, ritual, and social support measurably reduce stress hormones and can influence recovery. Ancient healers may not have understood cortisol or the immune system, but they understood, through direct observation, that a frightened, isolated sick person recovered worse than a sick person surrounded by care, chanting, and attention. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same reason a hospital nurse holding your hand still matters today, even with an IV already in your arm. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets told: quarantine. You might assume isolating the sick is a modern public health invention. It isn't. Long before germ theory existed, communities across the world independently arrived at the same instinct. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus describes isolating people with certain skin conditions outside the camp until they were examined again. During outbreaks of leprosy across medieval Europe, entire colonies were physically separated from the rest of the population. Nobody involved understood pathogens, but they understood something almost as important. Sickness spreads between people who are close to each other. You didn't need a microscope to notice that. This is the part of ancient medicine that deserves more credit than it gets. It wasn't guessing blindly. It was pattern recognition, refined over an almost unimaginable span of time, encoded into ritual, taboo, and tradition long before anyone had the language of science to explain why it worked. Of course, not everything ancient humans tried was effective. Trepanation, The practice of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull shows up in archaeological sites on nearly every continent, sometimes to relieve pressure from head injuries, sometimes to release what were believed to be evil spirits, causing seizures or madness. Remarkably, skull evidence shows that many patients survive the procedure, with bone regrowth around the hole proving they lived for years afterward. It's a brutal reminder that ancient medicine wasn't gentle, and it wasn't always right, but it was, again and again, an attempt built on watching, remembering, and trying something different next time. So here is the real shift to notice. The plastic bottle in your medicine cabinet isn't actually where medicine began. It's where an unbroken chain of trial and observation ended up after passing through hundreds of thousands of years of hands. Every antibiotic traces its lineage back to someone noticing that a certain mold kept bacteria away. Every painkiller echoes the same instinct that made a Neanderthal chew on bitter yarrow instead of spitting it out. You didn't inherit medicine as a finished product. You inherited it as the current chapter of the oldest ongoing experiment your species has ever run. Right now, somewhere in your body, something is going wrong. And when you notice it, you won't gather bitter herbs or read fever in the eyes of someone examining you by firelight. You'll reach for a small plastic bottle without a second thought, but that bottle carries a much older story inside it than you probably ever gave it credit for.